Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of Stanford Earth program. And I thought I'd start out by perhaps offering you a job. And I'm going to explain the job to you because it's a hard job. It's a job where you're going to work 14 to 16-hour days. And unfortunately, you're not going to get paid what you would consider really a living income, not enough to get by. But it doesn't take a lot of experience. In fact, it's a job that probably your parents did, and maybe even your grandparents. The thing about this job that makes it more difficult is that your employer doesn't seem to care that much. Now, in my case, I guess I don't care that much about what your income level is. In fact, I just want to figure out how to make you work more efficiently. In fact, I'll spend a lot of money on consultants to tell me how I can make you work more efficiently rather than figure out how do I pay you that wage that you need. And this job, sometimes you won't get paid until you finish the whole year of work, and then you'll see your paycheck. And probably some of you might not like the idea that you want to wait that long. So if you'd like to be paid in advance, we can do that, but you're only going to get 25% of what your paycheck would normally be. Now, I don't know how many takers I'm going to have for this job. And I imagine that some of you are kind of wondering, like, why would I take something like this? Well, this job was something I saw 30 years ago. This job is a coffee farmer. A coffee farmer who lives in a market that defines his price in a commodity market which he has no control or no understanding. And he or she really doesn't understand how to do the growing that you're asking them to do because there's no training from government. And when things like climate change come, there are no tools to help them out. And in fact, they're out there sort of facing the vagaries of nature all alone. That's the life of the coffee farmer job. And for 30 years, I've spent my life thinking about how do we make that job just a little bit better. Because when I was about the age of some of the graduate students here, I was going to go to business school. And I had just left Ashoka, a nonprofit working in Washington, D.C. as communications director. And I decided I was going to go down and do my own personal Peace Corps and hang out and live with farmers, coffee farmers, and maybe just hang out at the beach a bit. And a man came in one day into the Mexico City office, a man named Pedro. This isn't Pedro, but this is one of his colleagues. This is Mexico back in 1989, at a time when the Berlin Wall had fallen. So the system that set prices for coffee had now ended. The coffee quota system between the West and the East was gone. And so coffee prices were going from a steady rate that they had had for 30 years, and suddenly the price was dropping every single day on the farmers. And that's when Pedro walked into the office in Mexico, where I was volunteering, an office up on the second floor in Mexico City. And he walked in, and he'd gone on a bus for 7 hours from Nayarit, which is up in the north near Puerto Vallarta. And there he had 300 families who worked in a communal land system called an ejido. And they were all waiting for him to come back with an answer for how they would make money off their coffee this year, because the Mexican government had gotten out of coffee during the liberalization of Carlos Salinas. And I'm here as a wide-eyed intern as he walks in and he says, "I heard you're here to help us. Puedes ayudarnos to sell the coffee." And I looked around, I don't even know the first thing about selling coffee. And he brought in coffee in parchment. That's the peanut-like shell that surrounds the two sides of the seed that are coffee beans that are later roasted. And I realized in that moment that Pedro didn't understand how to send a sample to a broker in New York. Now, I didn't understand that much more, but he had asked me a question that really brought to life for me how was I going to help people like Pedro, because he needed a bridge to the market that he didn't know about. So I stepped into this system called the coffee commodity trade. And I went up and I started to learn more about it. And these issues that Pedro faced are still the same issues that coffee farmers face today. Low productivity, low income, lack of access to reliable markets. This is from a bank report from Rabobank of just this year. This is what coffee farmers are facing. And back then, Pedro and his farmers had lack of productivity. They needed more farmer training. And I guess the new one is now climate change. So these are the issues of a system in coffee that's really not working well, and yet you have 25 million farmers who are waiting for an answer on how are they going to grow coffee in a sustainable way. So here I am in 1989, pretty wide-eyed about what's possible. He asks me a question. I say, I'll grab some beans, and I take the beans, we roast them down there in Mexico, and I get on a Mexicana Airlines and go up to New York, because I had some friends there, and I go in and I open up the phone book, because there wasn't the internet, the first letter I saw, so I'm off at letter C, I'm at Cargill, and I'm trying to sell them an idea of coffee. I tell them about Pedro, about the 250,000 farmers in Mexico I represent. I've got my carousel projector, because I love to tell the stories, and all the brokers there look at me like, that's not how we buy coffee. We buy coffee based on the physical. It's called prima lavado, prime washed. It's not about places or people or the villages behind coffees. So I was pretty frustrated. But I didn't give up, because I'd heard about two guys up in Vermont who were making ice cream, who seemed to care about these kinds of ideas where business could be a force of social change and you could buy products and actually help. And so I went up and saw this place called Ben & Jerry's, which was a pretty small operation back then. And I said, how about getting the coffee beans into your ice cream? And they didn't say yes, but they didn't say no. They just had questions like, how do we do that anyway? And I kept sending my stories and telling it from Mexico. I would always send a quarterly letter to Ben, and suddenly we got in. And so since 1994, the beans from the Mexican coffee growers have been in your Coffee Buzz Buzz, or back then with Carlos Santana in the middle having Aztec Harvest, which was the smooth flavor. It didn't last, but the relationship between Ben & Jerry's and the coffee farmers from that co-op has continued for more than 20 years. What I'm here to talk to you about in a larger structure is about the coffee supply chain, thinking about it as a system. So let's take a look at the coffee supply chain. When I'm in my early 20s and I start to walk into coffee, I realize this is a very opaque, dark, no playbook that you can get. Nobody knows how to get into the coffee business, and the people who are really left on the outside are the farmers. So looking at this, the retailers and the people making the espressos don't really know where their coffee comes from, and what I think is worse is the farmers don't know who they're selling to, and I think this is a system that just doesn't work. But this is the linear supply chain that still exists in most of our commodities. Do you really know where your sugar is coming from? So coffee, though, was a little different. Coffee was grown in these beautiful places in this belt of warmth and high altitudes, places where people like Jackie Huddle from this year went down to Peru to see how coffee can be grown. And this is where coffee happens. And what's interesting about coffee is it's kind of the canary in the coal mine for climate change, because coffee is such a fragile crop and it needs such a band of temperatures of cool nights, but high altitudes and yet warm weather and well-drained soils that as we see the climate change a lot in coffee, we're going to see first coffee farms to be the first to exit. So it's interesting, but today it's an $80 billion worldwide industry. That's the value of coffee. And those big bags that weigh 152 pounds or 60 kilos, there's 145 million of those produced each year in about 60 countries. So this is where coffee, this is your morning habit. And I talked about the 25 million smallholder farmers. These are the people who make their living off coffee, trying to figure out how to make it work. So let's take a look a little closer at the supply chain, because you've probably seen some videos or maybe some photos in your coffee shop, but these are the elements of the supply chain that I decided needed to be more connected, and that's what I would call relationship coffee. So you have the growers, and we're looking here at the cherries. Coffee looks sort of like cranberries, and they take off that fleshy part, and inside are the parchment beans, and inside that the seeds. And that happens at the milling process. So here's a woman in Colombia who's let her coffee beans ferment for 24 hours. And then she may take this down the hill to a local mill, or maybe she's got her own little area to dry the coffee, or she takes it down to a co-op or a private exporter. This is how coffee beans start. 16-hour days for most of the coffee farmers until it goes into that final threshing, and those are the beans that you see. And at that point, somebody's got to connect them, but first they have to export them. So you need bigger houses, because coffee, like all commodities, goes in huge containers, right? It's a big volume business. Containers that weigh 40,000 pounds. So you can't send up just a bag of coffee, you have to send 40,000 pounds of coffee. Here's some coffees that are going up to a local Bay Area roaster out of Colombia, put on a big container. And then our role is to figure out how do we find customers for those coffees, how do we assure that those coffees are tasting correctly and that they have the certifications, in our case, that we want to see them have. And we have to taste the coffees. This is called cupping. And so everybody has to taste the coffees. But what I found when I started, and still exists so much today, is farmers don't know how to taste their own coffee. And that's a real challenge, because if you don't know what you're growing, you don't know how to fix it. And then it gets to the roaster. You're familiar with your roasters here in the Bay Area. And they transform the coffee from green to roasted. And then it gets to you in some delicious cup, as you can see in these espresso shots with a portafilter cut off at the bottom. Almost makes you want to have a late afternoon coffee, I think. And so this is the supply chain that was very complicated for me to figure out. How could I get the people at the top to care about the people at the bottom? And that was what I wanted to do with Relationship Coffee. And so instead of this linear supply chain, which I didn't think made any sense, instead of this opacity, I thought, what if we could have transparency? And what if we could just all be around the table and try to solve problems together? And it really seemed ludicrous at the time. And honestly, when I first started my business, I had a business school group look at it, and they said, we're sorry to tell you, Dave, but this model is not going to work, because if you show this much transparency, they're going to jump you, and your business isn't going to work. But I was undeterred, because I guess one of the good things I had going is I'd never worked at that job before. So I didn't know exactly how to do importing. So I decided to do importing the way I thought it would be, the way it should be done. And I did put everybody around a circle. So here this was the basic concept of Relationship Coffee, that you would bring all of the players together in disparate supply chains, not just everybody together like a regular conference, but wherever you were getting your coffee, who were all the players that were involved, and could you get together? Could you get together and solve problems? Could you really listen to the other side? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that connectedness has been sort of the cornerstone of the Relationship Coffee model and mutual benefit. And as I've grown the model over the last 20 years, I've realized that it's not just the people who are moving the coffee or selling the coffee or even financing the coffee. It's also who are the government actors and who's philanthropy and which international development groups are also working in those same neighborhoods, those same villages, who want to see change. How do you get them to be part of your supply chain? So to me, it seems like a very simple model. It's just you keep thinking, who else needs to be in this conversation? And as you do that, one thing that happens is that you have to be completely transparent, what they might call radical transparency, because you can't possibly have meetings like this at scale where you can keep everybody apart, not talking about what's the margin, what did you get paid. So I had to tell everybody, Sustainable Harvest is going to have to make 10% gross margin in the middle. That's what we'll do to do all of this, and I'll tell you what kinds of things we would do for people, like bringing them all together once a year, investing in farmer training offices and all those things. But I had to actually come out and say something that nobody in our business had ever done. And now it's done more because people start to understand margins. But it was a very interesting time to be out there alone saying, this is what we need to make, this is what the farmers need to make, let's all have a conversation. And it was stepping into some land that had never been trodden on before. So I'm going to talk to you first about, there's going to be 3 ideas: connect and adapt and innovate. So as a sustainable leader, which is an odd thing to be called because I just tried to keep figuring out how to make this business work. But I was always interested in what's the economic, the environmental, and the social aspects of who I was working with. I wasn't just a coffee geek. It wasn't just about how the espresso tasted. That's important to me, and I know that's the key to selling in markets. But I was also interested in how are the people living behind that. So I'm going to first give you an example of how we used connect. So connect, I think, is an important word for us, because at first, when we think about where we are now in our digital age, and we're reading the same feeds, and we're hanging out with the same people, and we're living in the same neighborhoods, and we have a lot of sameness happening in our lives, where we don't get tremendous amounts of diverse opinions. And that's sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes hard. But a supply chain seemed to be a perfect place where you'd want to have these different voices, right? A supply chain with all those people in that circle, they come from very different backgrounds. The farmer from Chiapas, Mexico, is very different than the buyer from a fancy roastery in San Francisco. They live in very different places and have very different ideas to bring to the table. And this idea that started to grow that everybody in the room had something important to offer. I remember telling groups of gatherings of coffee groups when we were starting the relationship model, and I said, all the answers we need to solve our problems are in this room, because we'd reached enough people that there was somebody who could help us solve it. We had the scientists, we had the agronomists, we had the financiers, we had everybody coming to this through that model that would help us answer how do we do that. And so this connect was where we would get away from, this is just recently I was at a coffee dinner, and this is how typically our industries operate. A lot of people who are same, and generally in this picture, what's missing? The coffee farmer. Right? This is all about selling coffee and buying coffee. In fact, it's the biggest place in the world that it happens. And it just seems to me when I see something like that, I think, wait a minute, how do we really create a sustainable model if this guy is not at the table talking about what he needs? Or this woman from Guatemala. So the strategy was, let's bring the diverse people together, the perspectives, and then let's sit down and solve the sustainable business challenges. And back in that day, I used to have to define, when I started calling my company Sustainable Harvest in 1997, I had to explain what sustainable meant every single meeting. So what is it that you're doing? What does sustainable mean? And for me, I was never following the Brundtland report, which was sort of the future generation's standard idea of sustainability. For me, it was simply, could we come up with a way to do business together where maybe our children would still be able to do business? If I can get to there, that would be a big deal. Because in our business in coffee, people would leave relationships over a fraction of a penny. And that's really bad for long-term business relationships. So I was always something much more practical about, could we just figure out what do we need to do to keep this relationship going? And I started using words like empathy and transparency and human connection in these large meetings called Let's Talk Coffee, because I wanted to do it at scale. And so this was my platform, Let's Talk Coffee. I would bring actually all those people that you saw in that circle, in that pie, and I would bring them together once a year in a producing country. We would gather and we would, for 3 days, talk about the problems that each individual supply chain, Pete's, Blue Bottle, Stumptown, Ritual, they're all discrete supply chains that have their own ecosystem that needs to be solved. And in 2003, when I started this, for many of these roasters, it was their first time seeing producers and listening to them for the first time about what their challenges, and vice versa. The growers really hadn't had a place where they could have an honest, open conversation. And as it grew over the years, we would start to really see, how do we get all these voices to start working together? People knew each other. We would work on, here's the issues we're facing. We even had the Stanford Design School come down and show us how they do what they do. And I remember we were all trying to make some kind of oral toothbrush or something oral. I don't remember what the test was, but you can't imagine what that was like for the Ethiopian farmers and everybody, the connectivity that happened. But it was all so that later we could get together and think about, how do we solve problems using design principles? These were examples of how bringing farmers together, bringing roasters together, bringing ideas from outside our own industry was a connectedness. And so as the years went by and Let's Talk Coffee continued, it became one of the premier events in the industry. And I kept it invitation only, because I wanted to be the reason that if you bought coffee from Sustainable Harvest, this was included in your price. You would get to see all of your suppliers once a year. Now, I had to pay for sometimes the farmers to get there because they didn't have as much money. I talked about that when I talked about that lousy job. But once we could get them in the room, it became very valuable, and so many problems got solved. So for example, if farmers needed financing, we could have all the banks there listening to the deals that were happening at the table, and the banks would come in and pre-finance those deals because they knew they were going to get repaid. These things started to really click, and Let's Talk Coffee was a success. And then another example that I think is really tangible right now with climate change was in 2013, there was a huge outbreak of a coffee disease called La Roya, or coffee leaf rust. And it's like phylloxera is in wine. And so what it is it's a fungus that kills all the leaves. Somebody described it as almost like AIDS. It kills all the leaves, the trees become denuded, and the trees die. And once a coffee tree dies, it's 3 more years before you can grow coffee again. So this was devastating. Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. There was migration coming into Louisiana, to New Orleans, of farmers who could no longer make a living because they had gone out. These are pictures of what happened there. So we were all stuck in 2013 thinking, what do we do? The farmers are asking us, what do we do? And we were able to go around to our roasters and all of our contacts in industry and science and say, we need to create some kind of toolkit. We need to have a recovery project. And because all the roasters knew who they were buying from, unlike back when I went to New York back in 1989, they were jumping up to say, yeah, we'll put a little money in, let's get this done. And we built manuals, we built a video toolkit, and we even put on a 300-person conference where we brought all the experts from around the world to talk about this issue and had the farmer leadership from Central and South America and East Africa there to hear about what this issue was. So that's an example of how Connect turns into a business case study. Let's talk Roya. Recently, I saw in a bank report that 50% of coffee won't exist by 2050 if we don't figure out some more solutions to climate change. It's a very scary figure in terms of a sustainable product. The second piece I want to talk to you about is adapt. So adapt is always something that we know more and more in this fast-moving world we have to do. When I first started with farmers, it was simply teaching them how to taste coffee or simply how the market worked or showing them the supply chain picture. But now it's much more complicated. They have to understand how to produce better coffee. So they have to understand how to do social media, how to use price risk management. It's become much more complex for them to succeed in the coffee world. And so now we have a program called Most Valuable Producer where we take the top 70 co-ops, those leaders, and we just continue to train them with the best tools. This was last week in Nicaragua. This is earlier in April where we're bringing the top speakers who can explain markets in our office in Portland. And they're learning all the tools that they need to succeed in these new markets that are opening of highly differentiated coffees. Because if you're a farmer and you don't get any training, it's going to be very hard for you to sell to some of these high-end roasters who are looking for naturals or honey processed and some of the things you might see if you go to a high-end coffee shop here in San Francisco or in Palo Alto. And we started to take the farmers out to places like Australia and take them on a tour to meet with roasters and to go directly. So basically my sales force started to be my suppliers, which is a very unusual thing to do. I gave them all the information about who our customers were because we're in it together. And there they would see the most advanced trends. And so we would have people from Colombia and from Rwanda and from Honduras and Mexico walking through the coffee shows, but also giving their talks at the coffee event we called Let's Talk Coffee Australia. And so all of these buyers got to meet the farmers firsthand, but more importantly, the farmers got to see what's the market. I was no longer trying to keep them away from the market. I was saying, come, let's be part of a partnership. And I got many of them to start looking at B Corporation status, because we're a B Corp, we have been since 2008, but I thought if the suppliers can start to think about how do they run their own organizations like a B Corp, like a benefit corp, they could be stronger as well. Now, I failed to mention I'm the largest fair trade coffee importer. So fair trade has always been a really good model for me because it gave a base price to farmers. And 90% of my coffee is organic as well. So those were the two markets that always paid farmers higher prices. And we will, since I opened the office, we've purchased about $500 million worth of coffee from farmers and at those higher prices. I felt like that was a really, for a small company that's still independent, it was a good run and continues to be a good run. And one of the reasons is that we've had to figure out how to innovate. And this is my last part. In coffee, it's always important to understand how to taste coffee. And because I was interested in technology from a personal side, I always thought, how do we take what we see, these iPads, and how do we get them down to farmers? And so when iPads first came out, we started building out toolkits to teach them how to taste. But then when we had to take it further, we started to build apps that would allow them to taste coffee in their co-op and taste coffee with their customers at the same time. So across 3,000 miles, they could be sharing the results of what the coffee tasted like. So we didn't have to always bring people together. And we got away from pencil and paper systems and started to use data systems so we could see how our coffee is improving through different processes or through different programs that we're doing. And this Tasteify app that we built has become a really big success story because it allows consumers all the way down to farmers to talk about flavor in a way that's visual and in a way that's really open and transparent. So thinking back to my job, it started with a man named Pedro saying, can you help us? and me wanting to answer that question. I had no interest really at that time of going into coffee, but I was really curious about how to fix something that I thought was broken. I was lucky that I saw some mentors out there who said, this is possible. And when I've been at my lowest moments, because business always goes up and down, I go back to those people and say, does sustainability really matter? And generally, in fact, always they say it does. You just have to find the right people. And so I hope that all of you look at your job and that it's better than the one I described at the beginning of my talk, that it could be something that's a force for social good, because business really truly can change the world. So connect, adapt, and innovate. Thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes or so we'd like to invite questions. Maybe you can go first.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Juan Gaviria. I'm from Colombia, and my family, my grandfather raised all his kids because of coffee. So thank you very much. This is very nice to hear something about Colombia that is different from drugs and that is actually
Thank you.
What will be your recommendation for a small coffee grower right now? You know, looking into the future, you know, like go organic, or you know, I think you mentioned some of the things that you will recommend. But what will be your recommendation? You know, where should they go?
My biggest recommendation to any coffee farmer would be that they look to diversify their income. So I think that diversifying their income comes from understanding the different kinds of markets that you can sell your coffee into, which are large volume coffee roasters and then smaller and very differentiated, and produce the right amount of coffee for those markets. Don't get fooled by what looks to be everybody's going one way or the other, because that's important. And then I think also making sure that coffee is not your only source of income. And ecotourism has become very popular in places like Colombia, and I think that's a good way to combine coffee and higher income opportunities.
David, you mentioned that coffee is an early warning system, a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. Can you expand on that a bit? And what are some things that you're already seeing, and what are things that people are fearing now?
Well, one of the reasons, so coffee is a canary in the coal mine. The first issue would be there are very few there's relatively few species and diversity of species of coffee that have actually come to the New World. So when coffee came out of Ethiopia and was brought through France and Indonesia, only two types of varieties of coffee really arrived, which are, Bourbon and Typica, and those strains have created pretty much all the coffees that we have in the New World in Latin America, and that's very dangerous, which is why a disease like Roya can be so rampant, because there's not the diversity of seed stock. So one thing that people are doing is they're looking at the problem with genetic diversity in coffee, and they're trying to get more seed banks built. Seed banks that have certified seeds, because a lot of people will sell you stuff, but you're not sure where it came from. So there's groups like the World Coffee Research that are looking at how do we build resiliency into the coffee stock, just the supply of coffee. There are certain things around climate change that are really difficult for anybody to deal with. I mean, the excessive rains and the excessive droughts. And some of the things that we're trying to do to help people in those cases is simply through the relationship model, having the roasters understand what the farmers are going through so that they don't completely shift their blends and move to somebody else, but understand this may be a one-time thing. So for example, in Peru, where Jackie was, there's a tremendous amount of rain. It's been very wet, and there's sort of an aspirin-y-like taste to a lot of the coffees. About 20% of the coffees taste phenol. And and most roasters will reject the container outright, and that relationship can end. So we've been out in front of that trying to help farmers understand how to dry better and get more financing into better drying systems, and having conversations about the importance of drying. And also with the roasters to say, we know you can't buy this coffee, but please don't leave this relationship. Let us help you find something interim. So sometimes it's things like that. So it's trying to look at genetic diversity, trying to deal with the climate problems, and trying to help people sort of survive in coffee. I have been told by people that when I was in Colombia, I was with a very big coffee buyer, and they said, there's no way these small farmers can survive. They just won't be around in 20 years. And that's a very scary thought, because sometimes I wonder, is that right? right? Will we not see coffee? All the predictions show that most of our coffee of the world will come from Brazil, where they can farm it mechanically. It looks like Kansas, and they can just do it at very low cost, or in Vietnam, where they have very low cost labor. So that's apparently going to be more than 50 to 60% of the coffee that we drink. So what about the Costa Rican, or the Guatemalan, or the Colombian? Those are things that really concern me. And I think that we have to, as an industry, collectively come together so that we can figure out what models work economically to protect farmers who want to stay in the business. Yes?
Yeah, David, thanks. Thanks for sharing your story. I mean, that was fascinating. As I understand it, the coffee plant is only viable in very narrow temperature range, and with global warming, it loses production and loses health and doesn't survive and so on. And if it's in a mountainous area, then the possibility is to take the plantation up the mountain. But of course, these are small farmers, and they don't have the money to do that, and perhaps somebody else owns the land, or perhaps it's a national park or whatever.
Absolutely.
And so I think as I understand the issue, they're really saying there doesn't seem to be an opportunity there to move up the mountain or to go into another field. And I'm not sure going up the mountain would work with a mass plantation like Kansas, which is pretty flat when you think about it.
Can't
So
really farm that way.
is there any other insights that you can?
You've hit exactly on the main problem. This idea that we say, well, this is getting too warm for coffee down here, so you're going to have to move up. How do you move, right? How many of us move our house? That's a big deal, right? You want to move to Portland? It's a big shift in everything, and it's not necessarily like the land's available. Plus, as you were saying, the question of erosion, question of national parks. So I think that gets back to the idea of diversification. So as those people who have the warmer lands, can we bring in cocoa? We've done Let's Talk Cocoa, because cocoa can grow at lower climates, and especially chocolate, is a market. It's not a solution. I've been in conversations with, we just did a B Corp collaboration with New Belgium Beer, and now I'm in conversations with Montana State scientists about what's possible with what goes into beer ingredients. They need cooler nights. And starting to try to think about what else can grow, that these farmers can farm. We may have our own problems about, well, I can't get that delicious coffee anymore that I used to get, but that may be out of our hands. But I want to make sure that people don't have to try to move to places that maybe they can't or afford, or that's not even available. But you've hit right on the main question. How do you move people around to farm?
Well, also, if I can speak from a consumer point of view, what about waking up in the morning with no coffee? I mean, hello.
Can you imagine?
It's the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah. Well, and I remember I wanted to say for that person who at the job, like, there's a lot of people who need this job to happen. They can't really wake up in the morning without coffee. So it's true, and I think what will happen is we'll lose that sense of taste of place. We'll lose the really delicious blueberry Sidamo coffees, or the jasmine Yirgachefs from Ethiopia. That's what we'll lose, and we'll have coffee that tastes more like commodity coffee, and I think that's a real loss for people. So hopefully we'll be able to find a way that one by one to find relationships that can save those farms. And then I'll come over.
So you talk about bringing everyone together at the same table. I'm interested to hear more about how, once you have them at the table, you have people who speak different languages and completely different understandings. How do you get them to communicate in an effective way?
We have to do a lot with translators, right? Everybody on my staff, almost everybody is bilingual. So the way I used to hire people was look for liberal arts graduates who spoke a second language, who had traveled on their own, who could not change their personality whether they were talking to a CEO or a campesino. And those people manage conversations, and they're taught to you need to be a three-way conversation on everything, whether you're selling a coffee or you're trying to solve a problem. And they're really facilitators. But they also understand coffee. You can train people to become expert tasters and things like that. And then you have the other translators that are not necessarily the coffee people, but really it's basically a staff and pulling people together for the language side. And sometimes it's training people how to ask the question that's kind of out there, but nobody wants to. There's sometimes discomfort. I love discomfort. I love walking into something and just sort of saying, how are we going to talk about this? And I try to impart that. And we hire very carefully in terms of how we look at people's profiles to see who's got the kind of the gumption to do that. So it's partly on how you hire and how you select your people too. What's over here?
Yeah. So thanks for the powerful story, really strong story. We have a group of a company from Finland. It's a country where we drink highest amount of coffee
That's
per
right.
capita.
The highest per capita
So
coffee.
definitely we need to see this presentation. And one question is related to sustainability. Where did you find the concept and idea for sustainability? Probably you were not the first young person to meet this kind of Pedro in the farming industry. But something has happened, something in your idea was ready to maybe start to unravel this question, how to solve it. So where there is some kind of theory of sustainability which have you studied before? How do you describe from the theory point, where is the backbone for the action you start to do?
You know, I wish I had a great theory behind me. I really do. I wish that I could say, I mean, I had to read a lot about sustainability, but at my core it was just the intuition that I had when Pedro was talking to me of wanting to figure out how do I save those, how do I help those 300 people that are back in his village, and how do I sort of let him help himself. And that for me was all that sustainability I needed, was just empower people to have the tools to take their own ownership over things. And that was enough, and it has been enough. I don't have to solve everybody's problem. I just simply need to give them the opportunity to empower and to build. And so that's about as far, and that's about as far as the sustainability goes for me. And I keep thinking, if I can just keep these people in coffee, family in Colombia, finding a roaster in the Bay Area, that's a good day for me, right? And I'm just going to try to keep that going as long as I'm in the game and as long as the company's in the game. But I don't think I have a strong, I mean, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from people like Julia and others about even doing the case study here with Stanford. I love the fact that we can deal with academics who can sort of look at bigger systems and understand where coffee fits in. It's really a privilege when we get to get that information, because we realize, okay, so what might have been a little bit of intuition or just sort of a gut feeling that this is the right thing to do, usually we know what's the right thing to do. And I always am sad for people who are in companies that are not B Corp, because B Corp, you put in your bylaws that you're going to make decisions based on not just shareholder value, but other stakeholder value, like community, like environment. And I'm always saddened by those customers who aren't under those rules, because they always say, I'd love to do the right thing, Dave, but you know I have to maximize the profit, so I've got to. And I just think, ooh, that's just not a long-term sustainable strategy. Okay, we've got 3, 4. Go ahead.
I worked for Packed Coffee in London for a while that deals with single estate and farmers. You may know of them. They're an online coffee seller. So I did a lot of coffee tasting with them and learned how to make the perfect espresso. I'm curious at what you've learned with coffee. Obviously, people are following your model, but what other, I particularly care about food, all kinds of food, whether it's grain growers, through the whole of the food supply chain, where you think that there are particular food groups or types of where your model is urgently needs to be applied, could be applied, or is already being applied, because it just seems such a no-brainer to do it for everything, but where you think that it should be happening, or any examples of where it is already happening, even below the radar, that we should be knowing about?
Yeah, great question. I would say food is a great place to start, food and drink, right? Because people love to taste things and they're interested in the story of how did that get created.
But also it's more to me that the supply chain is, I can't, just a polite expression, somewhat messed up. So
Yeah.
how can we...
So cocoa's a very messed up supply chain, for example, right? We see all the problems that happen in chocolate in West Africa, and the child labor and the fact that people, but so why is that? Usually if you look at the structure of those industries, it's oligopolies. You know, there's just not a lot of choice, but where you can start to differentiate products, and then start to get a small group of people paying higher prices for stuff that comes from a taste or a terroir or with a story and makes a difference and has an impact, you can start to change models. So I think beer, I think wine probably, I think chocolate, I think coffee. I'm not so sure about things like sugar, you know, if people will look at it that way. Clothing, for sure. clothing for sure. I think fair trade is probably a good beacon of where these things work, you know, because I think they're seeing where people are actually willing to spend a little more because they care about who grew it or who produced it. So.
I would like to have I won't hog the nut, but maybe after you've finished off the questions, I could have a chat with you about like grains and pulses. I think there's a lot of differentiation
I'm
and
sure you're
complete taste difference, and small farmers all over the US who are doing that and need to be more joined up. So
Yeah.
I'll bend your ear for a minute or two at the end. Thanks.
That's that. And I just spoke to the the Wool Association about a Let's Talk Wool, and I thought that sounded fun. Yes.
How do you use the message that you're helping out people on the first step of the supply chain? How do you use that message to bring in customers on the morning coffee side of things? Like, I mean, you see organic stickers in the window and things like that, but those don't really communicate the real personal effect that what you're doing has.
Yeah. I think it happens through the person who serves you when you go to that coffee shop. If somehow you can reach them, or if they've been on a trip, or if their boss has been on a trip, or somehow, I think that's why direct trade has done so well, where people can say, you know, I know the name of this farmer. That's a beginning step. It's like when we go to farmers markets, right? I'm not sure if those tomatoes are really organic or not, but this guy is really nice, and yeah, I'll buy them, right? So I think that's so for me. It's about people knowing the story and telling that and imparting it to the consumer. That's why it takes so long.
Do you notice that's something that customers are drawn to, that people really would prefer to go spend their money on morning coffee somewhere that has that kind of relationship? Like, can you measure that or see that?
I think we see a lot of big companies looking at, if you look at Nespresso and their ads that have gone from George Clooney to talking about individual farmers and their names in Colombia, it's clearly something that's resonating. I don't have a lot of the data, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think people stay with those brands for longer, right? But the challenge for sustainability is that people who will really pay more money for a sustainable product that doesn't taste very good is about 8 to 9%, right? So the part is you have to help these small farmers make a product that tastes really good too. That's the key, because nobody wants to buy something over and over that's just like, but I'm feeling like I'm making a difference. So yes.
So I'd love to hear, do you track at all kind of your impacts on the outcomes of interest? I mean, certainly you're paying more, which is great, but a lot of the concern around fair trade is they pay a higher price, but it's not enough to get these farmers out of extreme poverty.
Yeah.
So are you guys tracking kind of outcomes of interest, like schooling or things like that?
Yes, yeah, and we're doing it more and more because many buyers are sort of getting to that stage with fair trade where, like me, we've been in something for 20 years, and have we moved the needle on poverty? I don't blame fair trade for not moving it, and I do know that there's sometimes challenging organizational structures within cooperatives. I mean, it's not an organizational structure I use in my own business, right? I own Sustainable Harvest. I probably will turn it into an employee-owned company, but I know that sometimes we've seen with fair trade that the challenges for those buyers is they want to see more impact. So we're on a project where we're working with Michael Bloomberg's philanthropy in Rwanda, where he's given us, he came to us and said, we want to take this model, we'll provide the money, you provide the know-how, and we created a nonprofit that's reaching 25,000 women farmers in Rwanda whose husbands died in the genocide. So we have a lot of coffee coming out, and we have a lot of metrics that are happening there, and I think we're going to learn a ton about how do we gather metrics at the grassroots level in a way that's efficient, because it really isn't efficient to have people going down with notebooks and things like that. A way that's efficient, so as you're delivering the coffee, you can also deliver the impact. For me, it's up until this point, it was let's deliver the coffee and let's deliver that story. Like whoever is that Pedro at that farm, let's tell that story. But now we have to go further, and that's part of ADAPT. So it's expensive though, yes.
The community conservation world is really interested in coffee as an alternative income generating opportunity in a lot of very hard to access, low infrastructure places. But from the perspective of, is there a way we can integrate it with kind of functioning ecosystems, thriving ecosystems that continue to provide the services that a lot of these farmers depend on, fresh water, etc. So I'm curious, and when you go into a place and you look at how farmers are growing coffee, is there a thought of how that operation is integrated into kind of the natural systems, especially when it's in the upper reaches of a watershed, that maybe downstream farmers are dependent on that water source to actually irrigate their coffee downstream?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think the first thing that when I walk into a village, the farmers are saying, how much coffee are you going to buy and how much are you going to pay us? And we want to solve that problem first, but we may not have the tools or the people to answer the questions that you've just brought in, who would look at that landscape and say, what if you did this and this and this? And that's where a Let's Talk Coffee, or the kinds of partnerships that we're trying to build now with NGOs, with government, with philanthropy, is how do we bring that kind of knowledge down to those places? Because once you have a group of business leaders who are the coffee grower managers, and you start to show them, here's what's possible, do you have this back home? They can start for themselves to make these things happen, or look locally for that kind of stuff. But this is an area that we haven't really looked a lot at. I bet you and I would look at farms totally different. And that's why I would say, let's go together. That's really how it makes it happen.
Perhaps one last question.
I would like to understand in your presentation, how is currently the profit divided up in this supply chain, and what were you able to change? So let's take $1 of profit in a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
How much does Starbucks get, the importer get, the grower get, and how is your breakdown different?
Yeah, I thought I might have a slide that I didn't show, because I thought, oh, this will be too confusing. Let me see if I have it here. But the coffee, so if you took a bag of coffee, let's say it's a $12 bag, about $3, $3 to $3.50 is retail, $3 to $3.50 is roaster. So right there, about $7 out of the 12. About $2.75, I'm doing a fair trade in my $12 coffee, fair trade organic. $2.75 to the grower. There's about 58 cents or so, which is shrinkage, the coffee bean shrinks. 17 cents is sustainable harvest, and another about 10 cents, 12 cents is shipping. So that gets you there. So the bulk of it is upstream. Ideally you get farmers at least $2.75 out of that 12.
But otherwise, even in your network, this breakdown is the same for Starbucks or for somebody that doesn't go through you.
Yeah, and I do sell, but when a bigger buyer, when buyers do, the best money is made on the single serve, right? That's where you're making $40 a pound, right? When you do.
Do your farmers make more money than with other buyers, or is it at that level the same?
Well, so I buy fair trade organic, and what they did, speaking of studies, they did a study on what were our prices, and we had about a 30% higher price than the minimum fair trade price. So if fair trade organic is like $1.90, as it is today, we were consistently getting $2.30 for our coffees, but that wasn't something I really wanted to publicize, because then all my buyers would be like, wait a minute, I'm not going to keep having these relationship meetings because I'm paying more than if I bought from somebody who doesn't connect me. And why did that happen? Why did it happen that people would pay 30 cents more? Because they were having conversations about what would it take for those farmers to produce the quality they wanted. But it was one of those things that was kind of like, well, yeah, it's the right thing to do, but if your Christmas bonus is based on beating the coffee market price, I'm not your guy, right? Because I'm going to try to figure out what's the right price for everybody to get a fair share of the pie. So
With that, thank you very